The sky
Hold
over
still. I
Obsidian
need to
Reach
stop the
held no
bleeding.
sun.
It burns. I can't feel
Instead,
my
a
leg.
bruised expanse of
Stay-
violet
Hold
stretched
still.
overhead,
I need to stop the bleeding.
ionized dust
Burns, I
thick
can't
enough to
feel my
taste
leg.
like copper
I know.
on
Stay
the
with
tongue.
me.
Kalen Thorne spat a mouthful of dark fluid onto the jagged glass beneath his boots. The crunch of his heavy tactical footwear was the only rhythm in a world that had forgotten how to breathe. He moved through the wreckage like a ghost. The Scyther had swept through this mining colony like a plague of locusts, leaving nothing but skeletal remains and the lingering smell of ozone. His Mark 14 pulse rifle felt heavy in his grip, the power cell humming with a low, steady throb that seemed more alive than anything else in this godforsaken sector. Kalen had spent 20 years in the Terran Vanguard, 20 years of following orders, sleeping in coal barracks, and watching men die for coordinates on a map. He'd learned early that survival meant keeping your head down and your emotions locked away. Soldiers who got attached to their squad mates didn't last long. Soldiers who questioned orders ended up in unmarked graves on planets no one would remember. He'd been good at it, the emptiness, the routine, the violence without consequence. Until 24 hours ago when High Command had ordered a full evacuation, a tactical retreat that really meant every man for himself. The last transport ship had screamed into the upper atmosphere while Kalen was pinned down in the lower levels, surrounded by chittering Scyther scouts. He'd watched that streak of fire disappear into the violet sky and felt nothing. Just another day in the Vanguard. Just another mission gone to hell. Now he was alone, the sole survivor on a dead world. His tactical display flickered with static. The ion storm was throwing up so much interference that his HUD was just a blurred mess of warning symbols. He didn't need the electronics anymore. After a decade in combat, he could sense danger the way other men sensed rain. That was when he heard it. Not the chittering of a Scyther scout, not the groan of collapsing infrastructure. Something else. A soft melodic moan that sounded like wind passing through crystal flutes. Cullen dropped into a low crouch, his fingers instinctively finding the trigger. Years of training took over. Scan the perimeter, identify the threat, neutralize or evade. He rounded a collapsed support pillar and froze. She was lying half-buried under a sheet of translucent debris. Even in the gloom of Obsidian Reach, she glowed. Her skin was the color of a winter sunset, a pale, haunting amethyst that seemed to shimmer with its own internal light. Long, pointed ears pressed flat against her head in pain. Her hair was a river of liquid silver, fanned out against the black dust like a fallen star. Kalen's breath caught in his throat. A Vorian. He'd seen them before, of course. The Vorian nobility served as the Aegis Unity's elite warriors. They were the highborn, the genetically perfect, the ones who looked at humans as little more than cannon fodder with loud guns. The alliance between Terrans and Vorians was one of convenience, nothing more. Two species who barely tolerated each other, united only by their hatred of the Scyther swarms. But seeing one here, broken and discarded on a battlefield, felt like witnessing the fall of a god. Her armor was a marvel of bioengineering, white and gold plates that clung to her form like a second skin. It was torn now, revealing a deep, jagged gash along her spine that bled phosphorescent indigo fluid. The wound was bad, worse than bad. Without immediate medical intervention, she'd be dead within the hour. Kalen straightened slowly, keeping his rifle lowered. The logical choice was simple. He had enough power in his jump pack to cover 5 kilometers. She was paralyzed, a high-value target that would only draw more Scyther to his position. If he left her, he lived. If he stayed, they both became biomass for the hive. 20 years of training screamed at him to walk away. But something else, something quieter, made him hesitate. He thought about the last transport ship disappearing into the sky. He thought about all the brothers he'd left behind on a dozen forgotten planets. He thought about the coal barracks and the empty bunks and the way no one ever said your name after you died. He thought about what it meant to be human in a galaxy that treated people like ammunition. The woman's eyes snapped open. They were the color of a coming storm, swirling with gray and silver lightning. She tried to move, her fingers clawing at the dust, but her lower body remained deathly still. When she spoke, her voice was a pained musical trill, the language of the Aegis flowing like water over stones. Leave. The hive returns. I am dead weight. Kalen knelt beside her. His tactical sensors were already screaming warnings about approaching hostiles from the north. He could see the red eyes blinking into existence on the ridge above. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. He had maybe 2 minutes before the Scyther reached them. "Name's Callan," he said, his voice rough, "and I don't leave people behind, even the ones who think I'm a primitive ape." The woman stared at him with those tempest-born eyes. For a moment, something flickered across her face, not gratitude, not hope, something deeper, recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that another living soul had seen her suffering and chosen to stay. "Zyla," she whispered, her voice fading. "My name is Zyla." The ground began to vibrate. The chittering grew louder. From the obsidian ridge, 100 red eyes ignited in the darkness us like malevolent stars. Kalen looked down at the paralyzed warrior. She was an alien. She was the enemy's ally. She represented everything the Vanguard had taught him to mistrust. But she was also broken and bleeding and alone. Just like him. He made his choice. "Hold your breath, Princess," Kalen said, his muscles tensing. "This is going to be a rough ride." He scooped her up, surprised by how light she felt despite the heavy plating of her combat suit. She was warm, radiating heat that seeped through his tactical layers. Her fingers locked into the crevices of his chest plate, a desperate, instinctual grip. The first Scyther plasma bolts seared the air around them. Kalen didn't look back. He triggered his jump pack, and they launched into the violet sky, leaving the battlefield behind in a roar of fire and ozone. As they soared over the jagged landscape, Kalen felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. Purpose. Not the hollow satisfaction of completing a mission. Not the grim acceptance of survival. Something warmer, something that felt almost like hope. He didn't know that this single choice would change everything. That the woman in his arms carried secrets that would shake two empires. That his life as a soldier was ending, and his life as something far more dangerous was just beginning. All he knew was that for the first time in 2 decades, he'd chosen the heart over the mission. And whatever came next, he would face it standing. The interior of the ancient structure was cool and smelled of damp earth and forgotten technology. Kellen slammed the heavy blast doors shut, the thick iron groaning under the assault of the Scyther outside. They were safe. For now, the Vault of Whispers. That's what the old colony maps had called this place. A pre-war facility built by some long-dead civilization. The kind of structure that made archaeologists excited and soldiers nervous. Kellen didn't care about its history. He cared that the walls were 3 meters thick and the doors were holding. He set Zyla down on a stone plinth that looked suspiciously like an altar. His breath came in ragged gasps, his oxygen levels flashing red warnings inside his helmet. He ripped the helmet off, letting the cool, recycled air hit his sweaty face. "You still with me?" he asked, looking down at her. Zyla's face was pale. The lavender hue of her skin was fading to a sickly gray. She looked up at him with unfocused eyes, and through some instinct he didn't understand, Kalen knew she was dying. The spinal injury was worse than he'd thought. The Scyther venom was beginning to calcify her nerves, turning living tissue into brittle stone. Without proper Vorian medical technology, she had maybe an hour, maybe less. "There is a chamber," Zyla whispered, her voice barely audible. She pointed a trembling finger toward the back of the vault. "A resonator." Kalen looked where she indicated. In the center of the room stood a cylinder of translucent crystal, humming with a soft amber light. It didn't look like any human technology he'd ever seen. It looked organic, alive, like a lung made of glass. "What does it do?" he asked, already moving to drag her toward it. "It mends," she said, a tear of indigo liquid tracing a path down her cheek. "But it requires two, a donor, a bridge. It is a Vorian ritual, Kalen, forbidden for your kind. The bond is absolute." Kalen paused. Something in her tone told him this wasn't just a medical procedure. This was something deeper, something permanent. Outside, the Scyther claws scraped against the blast doors. The sound was like 1,000 knives on a chalkboard. They had maybe 10 minutes before the doors gave way. 10 minutes to decide. Kalen looked at Zyla, really looked at her. She was an alien, a warrior from a culture that had looked down on humans for centuries. They were supposed to be allies of convenience, nothing more. Two species joined only by a common enemy. But as he looked into her eyes like winter rain, he didn't see an alien. He saw someone fighting to survive. someone who'd been left behind, just like him. He thought about the transport ship disappearing into the sky. He thought about High Command's order to evacuate, to abandon anyone who couldn't keep up. He thought about 20 years of being treated like a disposable asset. If he walked away now, he'd be no different than them. "I've had enough of people telling me what's forbidden," Kalen said. He hoisted her into the chamber. The space was cramped, barely large enough for one person, let alone two. Their bodies pressed together from chest to knee. He could feel the rapid beat of her heart, a frantic drumming against his own ribs. Her scent was strange, like ozone and crushed jasmine. "What do I do?" he asked. "Place your hands on the sensors," Zyla breathed, her face inches from his. "And do not let go, no matter what you see, no matter what you feel." Callan placed his palms against the cool crystal walls. The chamber hissed shut. The amber light intensified, turning into a blinding gold that seemed to dissolve the world around them. And then the fire started. It wasn't physical heat, it was something else. A surge of pure information, pure connection. Kalen screamed as his mind was ripped open like a wound. He saw Zyla's memories, the soaring spires of her homeworld, all crystalline towers and impossible architecture. The cold vacuum of space during her first combat drop. The weight of 1,000 years of tradition pressing down on her shoulders. The loneliness of being perfect in a society that demanded perfection. And she saw him, the fire that consumed his colony when he was 12, the cold recruiting station where he'd signed away his life, the trenches on Varen Prime where he'd learned that mercy was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford, the stubborn pride of a man who refused to break, even when breaking would have been easier. The synaptic resonator was doing more than mending her spine. It was searching for a template, a way to bridge the gap between their two species. It found the commonality in their DNA, the ancient building blocks of life that all carbon-based organisms shared. The ancient civilization that built this device hadn't designed it merely to heal. They had designed it to unite, to take two incompatible forms of life and find the common thread that made them one. The resonator had found that thread in Kalen and Zyla, and it had woven something entirely new, and it began to weave them together. Kalen felt a strange sensation in the pit of his stomach, an amber spark that wasn't his and wasn't hers. It was something new, a presence, a tiny burning ember of life ignited by the resonance of the machine. Through the telepathic link, he felt Zyla's shock. "Kalen," she gasped inside his mind, her thoughts a shimmering melody of terror and wonder. "The machine, it has miscalculated. It is not just healing me, it is creating." "I feel it," he thought back, his own emotions swirling in the golden void. "It's like a light, a new heartbeat, small, fast, impossibly powerful." The resonator hadn't just healed Zyla's spine. It had taken genetic material from both of them and created something that had never existed before. A hybrid, the first child born of two species that had never truly touched. In the midst of the agony and the light, a connection formed, not just between Kalen and Zyla, but between all three of them. A bond more binding than any human marriage, more sacred than any Vorian oath. They were no longer two soldiers from warring species. They were a family. The light faded slowly. The chamber doors hissed open, and they both tumbled out onto the floor, gasping for air. Zyla stood first. Her movements were fluid. The paralysis was gone. She looked at her hands, flexing her fingers in wonder. Then she looked at Kalen. He was still kneeling, his head in his hands, trying to process what had just happened. When he finally looked up, something was different. His eyes, once a simple brown, now held flecks of her tempest silver. He reached out his hand, and he didn't even have to touch her to know exactly what she was feeling. He felt her hunger, her lingering pain, and most of all, the fierce, protective heat of the new life growing within her. "You saved me," Zyla said, her voice different now, deeper, resonant with the echo of his own soul. Before Kalen could respond, the blast doors finally buckled. A Scyther warrior, a nightmare of black chitin and razor-sharp limbs, lunged through the gap. Kalen didn't think. He grabbed his rifle, but before he could fire, Zyla's hand was on his shoulder. Her energy flowed into him. His focus merged with hers. He fired a single shot. The plasma bolt was different, infused with a strange luminous shimmer. It didn't just hit the Scyther. It disintegrated the creature on a molecular level, turning chitin and sinew into dust. Kalen stared at his weapon, then at Zyla. "Nice shot," she whispered, a predatory smile playing on her lips. "We make a good team," Cullen replied, standing to his full height. He felt stronger, faster, as if the world had finally moved into high definition. But they both froze as a soft, rhythmic pulsing echoed in their shared consciousness. A living rhythm, small, fast, and incredibly powerful. Zyla touched her stomach, her eyes wide with realization that transcended war. "Kalen," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The resonator. It didn't just mend my body. It fused our essences." Kalen looked at the door where more shadows were gathering. The Sither weren't stopping. They'd keep coming until there was nothing left to consume. But something had changed inside him. He felt a surge of protectiveness he'd never experienced before. A father's instinct he never knew he possessed. For 20 years, he'd fought for flags and coordinates and orders he didn't understand. Now, for the first time, he had something real to protect. "Then let's get out of here," he said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. "We have a kid to think about." He grabbed Zyla's hand. The connection between them was electric, immediate. He could feel her fear and her determination. He could sense the tiny spark of life between them, growing stronger with every passing second. They moved toward the secondary exit, a narrow maintenance tunnel that led to the surface. Behind them, the Scyther poured through the broken doors like a flood of darkness. But Kalen wasn't afraid anymore. He'd spent 2 decades as a disposable soldier in someone else's war. Now he was fighting for something that belonged to him, a future he'd helped create. And as they ran through the tunnels of the Vault of Whispers, with the sound of pursuit echoing behind them, and the radiant light of their bond illuminating the darkness ahead, Kalen Thorne realized something profound. He wasn't broken anymore. He was whole. The maintenance tunnel spat them out onto a gantry overlooking the secondary landing pad. The sight that met them was both a relief and a nightmare. Sitting in the center of the cracked Duracrete was the Eon Stray, a blocky, rust-streaked cargo vessel that looked like it had been held together by prayer and duct tape. It was an old Terran hauler designed for short-range mineral transport, but it was there, it was real. And right now, it was the most beautiful thing Kalen had ever seen. The problem was everything else. A Scyther Queen Guard, a monstrosity the size of a tank with 6 legs and a head crowned with jagged sensory horns, perched near the ship's boarding ramp. Surrounding it were at least 30 drones, their translucent wings buzzing with a sound that made Kalen's teeth ache. "That's a lot of bugs for one scrap heap," Kalen whispered, pulling back from the edge of the gantry. "They know," Zyla replied, her silver hair shimmering with an internal light. Through the bond, Kalen felt her certainty. The hive can feel the resonance of the child. They see it as a threat to their purity, an anomaly that must be erased. Kalen checked his rifle. The power display showed 30%. He looked at Zyla's phase blades. They were humming, but the light was dimming. They were both running on fumes. "We can't take them all in a straight fight," Kalen said, his tactical mind racing. "But we don't have to. We just need to get to that ramp. If I can reach the cockpit and prime the engines, the thruster wash will cook anything within 20 meters. "And how do we reach the ramp?" Zyla asked. "The Queen Guard has sensory horns. It will detect us the moment we step onto the pad." Kalen scanned the gantry. He spotted a series of fuel canisters stacked near a heavy crane. If he could trigger an explosion on the far side of the pad, it might draw the Queen Guard away long enough for them to make a break for it. "I'm going to create a distraction," Kalen said. "When the big one moves, you run for the ship. Don't wait for me. Just get inside and drop the ramp." "No." Zyla's response was immediate. The bond flared with her protest, a sharp spike of heat in Cullen's mind. "We move together. If you stay behind, you die. I will not let the father of my child be a sacrifice to a mindless hive." Kalen looked at her. Through the connection, he felt the fierce determination radiating from her core. She wasn't just speaking as a warrior, she was speaking as a partner, as someone who'd already lost too much. "Zyla, I'm the one with the long-range weapon," he said. "You need to get to the ship because you're carrying the payload." She stepped closer, her hand gripping his arm. Her touch was firm, her strength surprising. "We are the payload, Kalen. The child needs both the warrior's blade and the soldier's shield. I will provide the cover. You provide the fire. We move as one, or we don't move at all. Kalen sighed. There was no arguing with a Vorian princess. And if he was being honest, the thought of facing this alone made his chest tight. Fine, he said. But if this goes south, I want you to know that you're the most difficult cargo I've ever had to transport. Zyla's mental laugh was like a chime. And you are the most stubborn escort I have ever been forced to endure. They moved to the end of the gantry. Kalen took a deep breath, centering himself. He felt the bond tighten, the brilliant threads of their shared consciousness weaving into a tight, focused beam. He could see the world through Zyla's eyes, a landscape of energy and heat signatures, and she could feel the steady, cold calculation of his tactical training. Ready, he thought. Ready, she replied. Kalen raised his rifle and aimed at the fuel canisters on the far side of the pad. He squeezed the trigger. The pulse bolt flew true, striking the first canister and triggering a chain reaction of orange fire and black smoke. The explosion rocked the landing pad, sending shards of metal flying through the air. The Queen Guard let out a deafening screech, its sensory horns twitching as it turned toward the flames. The drones followed, their primitive minds drawn to the sudden burst of heat and noise. Now, Kalen shouted. They leapt from the gantry, their boots hitting the duracrete with a muffled thud. They ran, a blur of silver and olive drab, toward the boarding ramp of the ion stray. They were halfway there when the Queen Guard realized the deception. It turned back, its 6 legs churning the ground as it let out a roar that vibrated in Kalen's marrow. The drones closed in from the flanks, their wings creating a deafening hum. Kalen turned and fired a barrage of pulses, but the creature's chitin was thick. The bolts merely scuffed the surface. The drones were closing in fast. Keep going, Kalen yelled, his rifle clicking as it hit 5% power. Zyla didn't stop. She reached the ramp and spun around, her phase blades erupting into brilliant blue light. She stood her ground as the first wave of drones reached her, her blades moving with impossible speed. She was a whirlwind of destruction, carving through the Cyther as if they were made of paper. Kalen reached the ramp, his lungs screaming for air. He threw himself inside the ship, scrambling for the cockpit. The interior of the ion stray was a mess of loose wires and rusted panels, but the main console still had power. He slammed his fingers into the ignition sequence, praying to gods he didn't believe in. Come on, you piece of junk, he hissed. Turn over. The ship groaned. A low hum started deep in its belly, followed by a series of wet, metallic coughs. Outside, he could hear the Queen Guard slamming its weight against the hull, the entire ship rocking under the impact. Kalen! Zyla's thought was frantic. The Queen is at the ramp. I cannot hold it alone. Kalen looked at the displays. The engines were at 10%. He needed 20 to fire the thrusters. He saw the ship's internal diagnostics and spotted a series of auxiliary power cells intended for the cargo bay. If he could reroute that power to the main drive, it might give them the kick they needed. He tore open the floor panel and began frantically cross-wiring the leads. His hands were shaking, adrenaline making every movement feel clumsy. Through the bond, he felt Zyla's strain. She was being pushed back against the inner airlock, her blades clashing against the massive claws of the Queen Guard. He felt her pain, a sharp, burning sensation in her shoulder where a drone had managed to nick her. It ignited a cold, white rage in his chest. Hang on, he roared. He slammed the final leads together. A surge of blue sparks flew from the panel, singing his gloves, but the engine hum suddenly turned into a roar. The displays flickered green. 20%. Kalen lunged back into the pilot seat and slammed his hand onto the thruster override. Get inside, Zyla! Now! Zyla dove through the airlock, her armor scorched and her silver hair matted with grime. Kalen hit the ramp control. The heavy metal door hissed shut just as the Queen Guard lunged one last time, its claws scraping against the closing door and leaving deep gouges in the metal. The ion stray shuddered as the vertical thrusters ignited. From the cockpit window, Kalen saw a wall of white fire erupt beneath the ship. The Queen Guard and the remaining drones were instantly enveloped, their chitinous bodies incinerated by the heat of the fusion drive. The ship lurched upward, fighting the heavy gravity of Obsidian Reach. The sky turned from violet to black as they punched through the ion clouds and into the cold embrace of space. Kalen slumped back in his seat, his hands finally dropping from the controls. The ship was on a steady ascent, the autopilot locked on to a neutral sector 3 light-years away. He took a long, shaky breath, the silence of the cockpit feeling like a heavy blanket. "We made it," he whispered. Zyla appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. She was breathing in shallow rasps, her armor a wreck, her violet skin covered in dark bruises. But she was alive. And as Kalen looked at her, he felt the brilliant pulse of the bond, steady and strong. "We are alive," she agreed, her voice weak but triumphant. Kalen stood and walked over to her. He reached out and gently took her hand. For a long moment, they just stood there, two survivors of a dead world, connected by a miracle they didn't yet understand. Through the link, he felt her exhaustion, her relief, and a deep, quiet wonder. She looked up at him, those eyes that held lightning and peace in equal measure, searching his own. "The child is quiet," she said. "I think it is resting." Kalen smiled, a genuine tired smile. "Smart kid, it's been a long day for all of us." He led her to the small crew quarters in the back of the ship. There was only one bunk, a narrow thing with a thin, scratchy mattress, but it didn't matter. They sat down together, their shoulders touching. "What happens now?" Kalen asked, looking out the small porthole at the distant stars. "The Vanguard will come looking for me. The Vorian High Command will definitely come looking for you. Neither side is going to be happy about this." Zyla leaned her head against his shoulder. Her hair felt like cool silk against his neck. "Then we do what we have done since the moment you found me on that battlefield. We choose." Kalen nodded, his hand resting protectively near hers. "Yeah, we choose." As the ion stray drifted further away from the dying violet light of Obsidian Reach, Kalen Thorne realized that his life as a soldier was over. He was no longer a gear in a military machine. He was something else. A father, a partner, a bridge. And as he felt the tiny living rhythm echoing in his mind, he knew that no matter how many empires came after them, he would never let that bridge be broken. "I'm tired, Kalen," Zyla whispered, her eyes fluttering shut. "Me too, princess," he replied, pulling a tattered thermal blanket over them both. "Go to sleep. I've got the first watch." The ship hummed a lonely tune as it moved through the void. In the small darkened cabin, a human and an alien slept side by side, their dreams woven together by a brilliant thread that refused to snap. They had survived the dust of Obsidian Reach, but the true journey, the one that would change the galaxy forever, was only just beginning. The transition from the deep, velvety silence of the void to the chaotic hum of Haven 4 was like being slapped in the face with static. Haven 4 wasn't a planet. It was a sprawling, lawless collection of rusted shipping containers, decommissioned freighter hulls, and neon-lit docking bays tethered to a dying dwarf star. It was the kind of place where you could buy a black market heart, a stolen star chart, or a one-way ticket to oblivion, provided you had enough credits and a willingness to look the other way. Kalen sat in the pilot seat, his eyes bloodshot from 48 hours of hypervigilance. Beside him, Zyla was draped in a heavy grease-stained poncho he'd found in the cargo hold. It did a decent job of hiding her violet skin and the sharp, regal lines of her Vorian armor, but it did nothing to mask her presence. Through the bond, Kalen could feel her discomfort. To a Vorian, a place like Haven 4 was a sensory assault, a cacophony of competing smells, sounds, and jagged emotions. "Stay frosty," Kalen muttered, his fingers dancing over the docking controls. "This place is a meat grinder. If anyone catches a whiff of who you are, we'll have every bounty hunter from here to the core on our tails." "The air here tastes of despair and old lubricant," Zila's voice echoed in his mind. "How do your people survive in such filth?" "We don't survive," Kalen replied, steering the ion stray into docking bay 97. "We just linger." The ship settled into the docking cradle with a jarring thud. Cullen checked his sidearm, a standard-issue Vanguard pistol with 32 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition. It felt light compared to the power he'd wielded during the resonance, but he needed to blend in. They stepped out of the ship and into the docking bay. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and cheap synthetic food. A group of heavily augmented scavengers were stripping a nearby hull, their mechanical eyes glowing a dull red. They barely looked up as Kalen and Zyla passed. "Keep your head down," Kalen whispered. They made their way toward the gravity well, a sunken den of iniquity where the local fixer usually operated. Jax was a former sergeant in the Terran Vanguard, a man Kalen had served with during the siege of Alana Prime. In the military, Jax had been the kind of soldier who could find a crate of cigars in the middle of a vacuum. Out here, he was the guy who could make you disappear. The bar was a cavern of blue smoke and low-frequency bass. Kalen spotted Jax in a back booth, his face half hidden by a cybernetic visor. "Kalen Thorne," Jax said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Last I heard you were KIA on Obsidian Reach. Your unit got turned into fertilizer." "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated," Kalen said, sliding into the booth. Zyla sat beside him, her face hidden in the shadows of her hood. "I need a favor, Jax, a big one." Jax looked at Zyla, then back at Kalen. "You brought a friend, funny-looking friend. Smells like high-end Vorian tech in trouble. Is that a Void Walker under those rags?" "She's with me," Kalen said, his voice turning cold. "We need a full refuel, a new transponder code, and a dampener for her biosignature. And we need it 30 minutes ago." Jax chuckled, the sound like dry leaves. "That's a tall order, even for an old war buddy. That dampener alone costs 50,000 credits. And the transponder? That's high treason. Why should I stick my neck out for a ghost?" "Because you owe me for Vonus," Kalen said. "I dragged you out of that burning bunker while the Sither were chewing on your legs. I reckon that's worth a few favors." Jax went silent. His visor hummed as he processed the request. Through the bond, Kalen felt Zyla's tension. She was sensing something, a shift in the air, a hidden intent. "Kalen, he is lying," her thought reached him, sharp and clear. "His heart rate is uneven. He is not calculating the cost. He is calculating the reward." Kalen's hand moved slowly toward his pistol. Jack sighed and tapped a code into the table. "All right, Kalen, for old time's sake. My gearhead is in Bay 12. He'll get you sorted, but it'll cost you everything you've got in your ship's hold." "Done," Kalen said, standing. "Let's move." They left the bar and headed toward Bay 12, navigating the narrow, crowded corridors. But as they turned a corner into a darkened maintenance hall, Kalen's internal alarm screamed. "Bug out!" Kalen shouted, grabbing Zyla's arm. From the shadows, 6 figures emerged. They weren't scavengers or bounty hunters. They were wearing the charcoal-gray tactical gear of the Terran Vanguard's Black Ops division. These were the ghosts, the ones who made people disappear. "Sergeant Thorne," the lead soldier said, raising a pulse cannon. His voice was modulated, devoid of emotion. "You are in possession of a high-value biological asset. Surrender the Vorian and the hybrid specimen immediately. By order of High Command, you are granted a full pardon if you comply." Kalen felt a cold, hollow sensation in his chest. A pardon. A return to the only world he'd ever known. He could walk away from this. He could be a soldier again, instead of a fugitive. He looked at Zyla. She was already drawing her blades, her gaze like a winter tempest fixed on him, with a mixture of defiance and heartbreaking acceptance. She expected him to take the deal. In her world, loyalty was a transaction. "Do what you must, Kalen," her thought reached him, soft and sad. "Save yourself." Kalen looked at the soldiers, men he'd shared rations with, men who were now looking at Zyla as if she were equipment to be salvaged. The tiny pulse of new life throbbed in his mind. Zyla standing her ground against the Queen Guard, the resonator, the choice in that vault. All of it led to this moment. For 20 years, he'd followed orders without question. But some things were more important than orders. "The thing about family," Kalen said, his voice steady as he raised his pistol, "is that you don't get to choose who you're born to, but you damn well get to choose who you stand with." "Is that a refusal, Sergeant?" the soldier asked. "It's a hell no," Kalen growled. "Now get out of our way." The lead soldier didn't hesitate. "Tango 1 is compromised. Eliminate the traitor. Secure the asset." The hallway erupted into fire. The first volley of plasma bolts scorched the Duracrete inches from Kalen's head. He dove behind a heavy industrial crate, pulling Zyla with him. The world became a blur of blue light and deafening noise. "I thought you said these were your people," Zyla shouted over the din, her blades humming as she deflected a stray bolt. "They were," Kalen yelled back, squeezing off 3 shots. "But out here, people is just another word for targets if the price is right." The Black Ops team moved with terrifying precision. They used flanking maneuvers, smoke grenades, and sonic dampeners. Kalen felt a sharp pang of guilt as he recognized a young corporal, a kid named Miller, aiming a sniper rifle at Xyla's head. Kalen could kill him. It would be easy, but his hand hesitated. Miller wasn't evil. He was just following orders. He was exactly what Kalen had been 3 days ago. Kalen, watch your six! Xyla's warning was a mental scream. He spun just as a soldier lunged with a stun baton. Kalen parried the blow with his rifle barrel, kicking the man back into the shadows. Xyla was a whirlwind of violet light, her phase blades cutting through tactical armor. She wasn't killing them. She was disabling their suits, severing power lines. Even in battle, she was trying to respect his past. She was fighting for him. "We can't stay here," Kalin shouted, his pistol clicking empty. "They'll call in reinforcements." "The bay is sealed," Zila replied, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "I can feel the magnetic locks engaging." "Jax betrayed us," Kalin growled, slamming a fresh magazine into his pistol. The bond suddenly flared with terrifying intensity. It wasn't Kalin or Xyla. It was the child. The unborn infant, sensing mortal danger to its parents, sent out a pulse of pure, raw energy. The lights in the maintenance hall flickered and died. The soldiers' tactical visors shorted out, leaving them blind in sudden darkness. Luminous light began to leak from Kalen's skin. It wasn't a choice this time. It was an overflow. He felt Xyla's hand lock onto his, and the power doubled. Now her thought was a command. They moved together, a single entity of light and steel. The darkness didn't matter. They could sense the thermal signatures of the soldiers as if they were beacons. Kalen didn't fire a single shot. He used the butt of his rifle and his enhanced strength to knock the soldiers unconscious, clearing a path toward the secondary vent shafts. They scrambled into the narrow ducting, the sound of soldiers recovering echoing below. The vents were cramped and smelled of recycled air and old grease, but they led toward the station's outer hull. "We have to go EVA," Kalen said, his voice echoing. "If the docking bay is locked, we'll have to blow the exterior hatch and jump to the stray." "Without suits?" Xyla asked, her eyes wide. "Kalen, the vacuum will kill you in seconds." "I've got an emergency breather," Kalen said, pulling a small mask from his belt. "It'll give me 30 seconds of oxygen. Your Vorian physiology can handle the cold longer than mine. It's a gamble, but it's the only one we've got." They reached the exterior hatch, a circular metal port looking out into the vast, indifferent expanse of space. The ion stray was visible, drifting only 50 meters away. Kalen looked at Xyla. He saw the fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for the life she carried. "I'm sorry, Xyla," he whispered. "I'm sorry I dragged you into this mess." Xyla reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers cool and soft. "You didn't drag me, Kalen. You saved me, and you chose to stay. That is more than any Vorian warrior had ever done for a Terran." He nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "All right, on three. 1, 2, 3. He slammed the emergency release. The air was sucked out with a violent hiss, pulling them into the void. The transition was a nightmare of cold and silence. Kalen's skin felt like it was being pricked by a million needles. His lungs burned as he clamped the breather over his mouth. He could see the stray. It looked so far away. He fired his jump pack, the small thrusters struggling to orient them in zero gravity. Xyla clung to him, her silver hair floating like a nebula. They hit the hull with a bone-jarring impact. Kalen scrambled for the manual airlock, his fingers numbing rapidly. He found the lever and yanked it. The airlock cycled with agonizing slowness, but finally it hissed open. They tumbled inside, gasping for air. Kalen lay on the floor, his skin mottled from exposure. Xyla crawled over to him, her hands glowing with soft violet light. She pressed them to his chest, and warmth flooded back into his body. "You are a fool, Kalen Thorne," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Yeah," he gasped, a weak smile touching his lips. "But I'm your fool." They didn't have time to celebrate. The ship's sensors began to wail. A Vanguard cruiser had just dropped out of slipspace, its massive hull looming over Haven 4 like a predator. "They're here," Kalen said, dragging himself to the pilot seat. "The whole damn fleet." "No," Xyla said, her voice filled with dark realization. "It is not just the Vanguard. Look." On the opposite side of the station, another rift opened. A Vorian dreadnought, elegant and terrifying, emerged from the void. Its weapons were already locked onto the Vanguard cruiser. They weren't just being hunted by bounty hunters or a single squad. They were the center of a galactic tug-of-war. Two empires ready to go to war over the child. Kalen looked at the displays, then at Zila. "We can't go to the Alliance," Kalen said, his voice grim. "And we can't go to the Vorian hegemony. We're on our own." "Then we find somewhere they cannot follow," Zila said, her hand resting on his. "To the Riftward territories. To the edge of the map." "It's a suicide mission," Kalen said. "Perhaps," Zyla agreed, "but we will face it together." Kalen slammed the throttle forward. The Ion Stray's engine screamed as they jumped into the unknown. Behind them, the two empires began to fire. Haven 4 disappeared in a flash of light as they plummeted into the darkness of the rift. Kalen felt the pulse of new life once more. It wasn't a warning, it was a steady, rhythmic promise. A future that hadn't been written yet. He realized then that the lesson wasn't just about choosing family, it was about the cost of that choice. And as the stars blurred into streaks of light, Kalen Thorne knew he would pay any price to keep his family whole. The Ion Stray groaned like a dying animal. A deep metallic shudder vibrated through the floorboards and into Kalen's bones. They had been in the Riftward territories for 6 hours, and the ship was already screaming for mercy. Outside the cockpit glass, the universe had dissolved into a hallucinogenic swirl of bruised purples, sickly greens, and flashes of static white. This was the Rift, a spatial scar where the laws of physics went to die, where the wrecks of 1,000 years of failed exploration drifted like bleached bones in a desert. "Sit rep," Kalen muttered, his voice cracking. He hadn't slept in 3 days, and the brilliant veins of energy under his skin were throbbing with a frantic, uneven rhythm. "Engine 3 is flatlined," Zyla replied from the co-pilot's chair, her hood pulled back to reveal sweat glistening on her lavender brow. "The coolant lines are choked with ionized dust. We are running on 40% thrust, and the internal dampeners are failing." Kalen wiped a smear of grease from his forehead. Through the bond, he could feel Zyla's exhaustion. It was a heavy, cold weight that sat at the base of his skull, but deeper than that, he felt the child. The amber spark was no longer a quiet ember. It was a sun, radiating a heat that felt both miraculous and terrifying. The baby was feeding on the ambient energy of the rift, its tiny developing mind reaching out to touch the ghosts of the derelict ships they passed. "They are lonely," a thought drifted through Kalen's mind. Not his own, not Zyla's. A soft, echoing impression from the womb. "The sleeping giants want to wake up." "Keep your head in the game, kid," Kalen whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the baby or himself. A sudden sharp chirp from the long-range sensors made Kalen's heart jump. A thermal signature had appeared on the edge of the static. Small, fast, and aggressive. "We've got a tail," Kalen growled, his hands tightening on the flight stick. "One ship, looks like a Terran Interceptor Mark V. High speed, high maneuverability. They must have followed our warp trail before it collapsed." Zyla leaned forward, her gaze like a winter tempest narrowing. "Only one? That is not the Vanguard's way. They hunt in packs." "It's a scout," Cullen said. "If he pings our location, the whole damn fleet will be on us in 10 minutes. We have to drop him before he sends the signal." The interceptor closed the distance with terrifying speed. It was a sleek black needle of a ship, designed for one thing: interdiction. As it drew closer, the comms channel crackled to life, cutting through the white noise of the rift. "Sergeant Thorne, this is Flight Lieutenant Miller." The voice was young, scared, and desperately determined. "I know you're in there. Please don't make me do this. High Command has authorized lethal force. But if you power down now, I can escort you to a neutral zone. I don't want to kill a brother." Kalen's jaw tightened. Miller, the kid from the maintenance hall on Haven 4. One of the best pilots Kalen had seen in the academy. He had a wife and a 2-year-old daughter back on Mars. "Miller, you're out of your depth," Kalen said into the comms, his voice steady. "The rift is eating your sensors. You won't make it back if you keep pushing. Turn around, kid. Go home to your family." "I can't do that, Sarge." Miller's voice wavered. "Orders are orders. You're a traitor. You've got an alien bioweapon on that ship. I have to bring you in." Zila's hand rested on the console, her fingers glowing with a faint defensive light. "He is closing for a lock. If he fires his EMP, our life support will fail instantly." Kalen looked at the display. Miller was moving into firing position. In any other situation, Kalen would have pulled a barrel roll and shredded the interceptor's engines. But he looked at the brilliant glow in Zyla's eyes and the way she held her stomach. The humanistic instinct he'd spent a decade ignoring began to burn in his chest. Was Miller his brother? Or was this alien woman and her unborn child his family? The military had told him that loyalty was a vertical line. You looked up to the officers, you looked down to the grunts. But the bond was telling him something else. Loyalty was a circle. Suddenly, the rift flared. A massive surge of gravitational energy erupted from a nearby derelict, a Vorian cruiser that had been dead for 300 years. The ancient ship's reactors, stirred by the presence of the child, let out a final violent gasp of radiation. The ion stray groaned but held steady, its hybrid shields absorbing the shock. But Miller's interceptor wasn't so lucky. The Terran tech, unshielded against Vorian energy, shorted out instantly. The sleek black ship began to spin wildly, caught in the gravitational pull of the derelict. "Mayday! Mayday!" Miller's voice screamed over the comms, distorted by static. "I've lost engine power. I'm being pulled into the hull. Kalen, help me!" Kalen watched the interceptor on the view screen. It was seconds away from being crushed against the frozen metal of the ancient cruiser. "Kalen, we must go," Zyla said, her voice urgent. "The surge has alerted the Scyther scouts in the area. If we stay to help him, we will be trapped." Kalen's hand hovered over the throttle. He could leave. He should leave. Miller was the enemy now. He was the one who had come to take Zyla away, to take the child. Saving him was a tactical blunder of the highest order, but then he felt the child's presence again. Not a thought this time, but a feeling. A deep, resonant sadness. The baby felt Miller's terror. It felt the man's love for his daughter on Mars. To the child there was no vanguard, no Vorian, no enemy. There was only life. "I can't leave him, Zyla," Kalen said, his voice a low whisper. "He tried to kill us," Zyla reminded him, though her own resolve seemed to be wavering as she felt Kalen's intent through the bond. "He's a kid who thinks he's doing the right thing," Kalen said, his fingers flying over the tractor beam controls. "If I leave him to die, I'm no better than the monsters we're running from. If we're going to build a future for this kid, it can't be built on the bodies of people who were just like me." Kalin swung the ion stray around, the engine screaming in protest as he fought the gravitational pull. He lined up the tractor beam and fired. The blue beam locked onto the interceptor, jolting both ships. "Gotcha, you little screw-up," Kalin grunted, sweat pouring down his face. He pulled the interceptor away from the derelict, dragging it into the relatively stable wake of the ion stray. Miller's ship was a wreck, but the cockpit was still intact. "Miller, do you copy?" Kalen shouted. I copy, Sarge," the kid gasped. "Why? Why did you save me?" "Because someone has to stop the bleeding, Miller," Kalen said. "I'm docking you to our secondary airlock. You stay there, don't touch anything. If you try to play hero, I'll blow the hatch myself. You got me?" "Crystal, Sarge," Miller whispered. As the interceptor latched onto the stray, Kalen felt a shift in the bond. The child's presence grew warm, a radiant wave of approval that washed through his mind. Zyla looked at him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and profound respect. "You are a strange man, Kalen Thorne," she said. "Yeah, well," Kalen said, wiping his eyes. "Being human is a lot more work than I thought it would be." But the moment of peace was short-lived. The sensors flared again. This time it wasn't a single ship. The rift was opening behind them. A massive Vorian dreadnought and a Terran carrier had both found the surge. They were coming through together, not fighting each other, but acting in a terrifying unified front. And between them and the ion stray, the Scytherhides were beginning to wake up, their biological ships emerging from the shadows of the derelicts like maggots from a corpse. "It's a party," Kalen said, his voice grim as he looked at the hundreds of red signatures filling his screen. "And we're the main course." The ion stray was a speck of dust caught between three tidal waves. To their left, the Terran carrier Prometheus was launching squadrons of Raptors. To their right, the Vorian dreadnought Star of Vara was charging its primary ion cannons. And directly ahead, a massive Scyther hive ship, a pulsating mass of black chitin and glowing green bile, was opening its maw to swallow them whole. "They aren't firing at each other," Zyla whispered, her eyes wide with horror. The Aegis and the Terrans. They have made a pact. They would rather destroy us together than let either side have the child. Kalen felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. This was the ultimate betrayal. The two empires that had spent centuries at each other's throats had found the one thing they hated more than each other, a bridge they couldn't control. Miller, Kalen barked into the internal comms. You seeing this? Your bosses are working with the people they told us were subhuman monsters just to kill a baby. That the Vanguard way? There was a long silence from the airlock. It doesn't make sense, Sarge. Miller's voice was small, broken. We're supposed to be the good guys. There are no good guys in a war of shadows, kid, Kalen said. Only people who survive and people who don't. The ship rocked as a stray plasma bolt from a Scyther scout clipped their aft shields. The lights flickered, and the brilliant energy under Kalen's skin flared brightly, illuminating the cockpit in warm amber light. Kalen, Zyla said, her voice taking on a strange melodic quality. The Stray cannot outrun them. The engines are at 5%. The hull is buckling. I know, Kalen said, his hands white on the controls. I'm looking for a hole, Zila. I'm looking. There is no hole in the physical world, Zila said. She stood and walked toward him, her movements effortless despite the chaos. She placed her hand over his on the flight stick. But the child, he sees a path. He sees the resonance of the rift. If we fully merge, if we give him our strength, he can fold the space around us. Kalen looked at her. He knew what she was asking. The synaptic resonance they had experienced in the vault was only a fraction of what she was proposing now. To fully merge their consciousness without the machine. It was a point of no return. They wouldn't be two people anymore. They would be something else. A permanent convergence. It'll kill us, won't it? Kalen asked. As individuals, I mean. We won't be Kalen and Zyla anymore. We will be more, Zyla said, her eyes swirling with silver lightning. We will be the foundation of his world. Is that not what a family is, Kalen? To lose oneself so that the next generation can find their way. His life as a soldier felt like another man's memory now. 20 years in coal barracks, lonely nights, the feeling of being a shadow in his own skin, all of it dissolving like smoke. Then he looked at Zyla. He felt her love, her fear, her courage. He felt the vital drumming of the child, a rhythm that had become more important to him than his own. He realized then that the lesson wasn't about surviving. It was about belonging. Do it, Kalen said, his voice thick with emotion. Let's go home. Zyla knelt between him and the console, her hands locking onto his. She leaned her forehead against his, and the world exploded. It wasn't fire this time, it was water, a deep, cool ocean of consciousness that swallowed them both. Kalen felt his memories dissolving, the smoke of Varen Prime, the taste of cheap whiskey, the sound of his mother's voice, all of it flowing into Zyla, and her memories flowed into him. The songs of the Vorian mountains, the cold majesty of the stars, the pride of her ancestors. In the center of the storm, the child stood like a titan. The amber spark expanded, reaching out with ethereal tendrils to touch the ship, the rift, and the empires beyond. Outside, the crews of the Prometheus and the Star of Vera watched in stunned silence as the ion stray began to glow. It wasn't the light of an explosion, it was the light of a star being born. The battered cargo hauler transformed, its rusted plates shimmering with brilliant, translucent energy. The child spoke, not in words, but in a vibration that resonated through every hull in the sector. It was a cry of pure existence, a demand to be seen. The Scyther hive ship lunged, its mandibles snapping, but as it touched the radiant aura of the Stray, the creature didn't die. It was changed. The black chitin turned to glass. The green bile turned to clear water. The hive ship, a creature of pure consumption, suddenly stopped. Its red eyes turned silver, and it drifted away, its predatory instinct replaced by bewildered peace. What is happening? Miller's voice came through the link, filled with wonder. Evolution, kid? Kalen's voice echoed, though it sounded like 1,000 voices speaking as one. We're rewriting the rules. The Einstray began to accelerate, not through thrusters, but by sliding through the folds of space that only the child could see. The ships of the two empires fired, their massive cannons unleashing enough energy to crack a planet. But the beams passed through the stray as if it were a ghost. They were no longer in the same dimension of reality. As they plunged into the heart of the rift, Kalen felt a moment of intense clarity. He saw the future, a world where humans and Vorians lived in the light of a new species. He saw a galaxy where the scars of war were healed by the same energy that now filled his veins. But he also felt the cost. His body was fading, his physical form becoming a vessel for the power of the child. It hurt, a deep, soul-rending ache that made him want to scream. "I am here," Zyla's voice comforted him. "We are here, we are one." Kalen leaned into the pain, embracing it. He thought of Miller, docked safely to the hull, being carried into a new world. He thought of the soldiers on the Prometheus, who would have to go home and explain why their weapons had failed against a thing made of love. "One last jump," Kalen whispered, his voice a fading echo. The ion stray hit the center of the rift. There was a final blinding flash of amber light that consumed the entire sector. When it faded, the stray was gone. The Scyther hive was a drifting garden of glass, and the two empires were left staring into the void, their weapons cold and their hearts filled with an inexplicable, haunting sense of loss. Inside the ship, in the silence that followed the jump, a new sound emerged. It wasn't a pulse rifle or a phase blade. It wasn't the roar of an engine or the scream of a dying alien. It was the soft, fragile cry of a newborn baby. Kalen Thorne opened his eyes. He was lying on the floor of the cockpit, his skin pale and his armor shattered. Beside him, Zyla was breathing slowly, her silver hair spread out like a fan. She looked older, her face etched with the lines of a woman who had lived 1,000 lives in a single hour. He looked toward the center of the room. There, floating in a sphere of soft, radiant light, was a child. He was beautiful. A perfect fusion of his parents, with lavender skin, brown hair, and eyes that held the wisdom of the stars. The baby looked at Kalen and smiled. "Hey there, little guy," Kalen whispered, his voice trembling with joy he had never known. He reached out his hand, and the baby's tiny violet fingers curled around his thumb. In that touch, Kalen felt the entire universe. He felt the struggle, the pain, the sacrifice, but most of all, he felt the peace. They had reached the edge of the map. They were in a place where no empire could reach them, a hidden sanctuary within the Riftward territories. Zyla sat up, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at her son. "We chose well, Kalen Thorne." "Yeah," Kalen said, pulling her close. "We chose the only thing that mattered." Outside the porthole, the stars of the rift glowed with a new gentle light. The war was far away, the empires were distant memories. And for the first time in his life, Sergeant Kalen Thorne was home. The silence of Ethgard was absolute, 1 year later. The settlement on the moon didn't look like a military outpost or a Vorian colony. It was a collection of structures built from salvaged ship hulls and native stone, woven together by bioluminescent vines that grew in the rift's eternal twilight. There were no walls, no turrets, only the sound of wind through silver-leaf trees and the distant rhythmic crashing of the violet sea. Kalen Thorne stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, a heavy stone hammer in his hand. He was no longer wearing his vanguard armor. Instead, he wore simple trousers made of woven fiber and a tunic of Vorian silk. His skin was tanned by the strange sun, and the brilliant veins of the pond had settled into a faint, shimmering lattice that pulsed only when he was near his family. He watched as Miller, now the settlement's primary engineer, worked on a solar array near the water's edge. The kid was laughing, shouting something to Zyla as she practiced her forms with the phase blades. But she wasn't training for war. She was moving with fluid, artistic grace, the blades leaving trails of blue light that seemed to harmonize with the song of the birds. And then there was Valen. The child was walking now, his lavender feet sure on the mossy ground. He was a year old, but he had the awareness of a 10-year-old human. He didn't speak with words yet, but he didn't need to. Every time he laughed, the flowers in the valley bloomed a little brighter. Every time he reached out his hand, the air seemed to hum with protective warmth. Valen looked up at the ridge and waved a tiny hand. Kalen felt a surge of pure, unadulterated love through the bond, a feeling so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He set down his hammer and walked down the path toward them. His gait was different now. The stiff, guarded stride of a soldier had been replaced by the relaxed, confident walk of a man who knew he belonged. As he reached the valley floor, Zyla deactivated her blades and stepped toward him. She looked radiant, her lavender skin glowing with health and peace she had never known in the Vorian courts. "The forge is ready, Kalen," she said, her voice a warm melody. "Miller has finished the cooling vents. We can begin crafting the new conduits tonight." "Good," Kalen said, pulling her into a brief, firm embrace. "We're going to need them before the winter storms hit." They sat together on a bench carved from a fallen Freota rib, watching Valen play with small, bioluminescent creatures in the tall grass. It was a simple moment, an ordinary moment, and that was what made it a miracle. Kalen looked at his hands, the same hands that had held a rifle for 20 years, the same hands that had taken lives in the name of a flag. Now they were covered in the dust of the earth, the sap of the trees. They were hands that built. They were hands that held. He realized then that his transformation wasn't just about leaving the military. It was about dismantling the armor he had built around his soul. He had spent his life thinking that strength was about how much you could endure alone. He had learned that true strength was about how much you could share with others. "I spent 20 years believing that the uniform was my skin and the mission was my soul," Kalen said quietly, more to himself than to Zila. "I thought that loyalty was a debt I owed to a command center 3 million kilometers away. A place filled with people who didn't know my name but knew exactly how much my life was worth in credits." Zyla listened, her hand resting gently on his. "I lived in a world of us and them, of borders and protocols, of targets and casualties. I was good at it. I was a professional at being a shadow." He looked at Valen, who had found a crystalline stone and was holding it up to the light, watching it refract into 1,000 colors. "But standing here with the dirt of a new world under my fingernails and the heartbeat of my son echoing in my mind, I see how small that life was. I used to think that being a soldier meant protecting humanity. I didn't realize that to truly protect humanity, you have to be human first." Zyla leaned her head against his shoulder. "You chose the heart over the mission." "Yeah," Kalen said, "and it saved me." The sun began to set behind the jagged peaks of the rift, casting long golden shadows across the valley. Valen ran over to Kalen, his silver hair glowing in the twilight. He climbed into his father's lap, his small, warm body a weight that Kalen never wanted to put down. Zyla leaned her head against Kalen's shoulder, her hand resting on Valen's back. Across the clearing, Miller sat by the fire, sharpening a tool and humming a song his mother had taught him on Mars. The two empires were still out there, somewhere beyond the folding space of the rift. They were still building ships, still training soldiers, still drawing lines in the dust of distant planets. But something had changed. The crews of the Prometheus and the Star of Vera had returned home with a story that no propaganda could erase. They had fired their most powerful weapons at a child made of light, and those weapons had failed. Not because the child was stronger, but because the child was something their war machines were never designed to fight, an answer to a question no empire had thought to ask. In the strategic rooms of both capitals, generals and councils sat in silence, trying to explain how love had beaten firepower. They never would. Here on Ethgard, the lines had been erased. The war was a distant memory, and the bridge was solid. Kalen looked at his son's face, a face that held the features of 2 worlds and the promise of 1,000 more. He felt the bond flare one last time, a surge of pure crystalline joy that radiated from the child and filled every corner of his being. He had spent his life looking for a reason to fight. He had finally found a reason to live. "I used to think that my life was a series of orders I had to follow," Kalen said softly, speaking to the stars now. "A path that had already been laid out for me by people I would never meet. But in the end, it was the one unauthorized choice, the one unprofessional act of mercy that saved me." He looked down at Valen, who had fallen asleep in his arms, tiny fingers still clutching Kalen's thumb. "It makes me wonder about the paths we all walk and the armor we all wear to keep the world at bay. I spent so long carrying my anger like a shield, only to realize it was actually a wall keeping me from the very thing I was searching for." He stood up, lifting his son gently. The first stars of the rift began to twinkle above, and Kalen didn't look at them with a soldier's eye for navigation, but with a father's eye for wonder. "I had to lose my rank, my home, and my identity to finally find out who I was," he said to the gathering darkness. And I wonder, as you look at the life you've built and the roles you've been told to play, is there a choice you've been afraid to make? Is there a bridge you've been hesitating to cross because the world told you it was impossible? Zyla stood beside him, her arm around his waist. What would happen, Kalen whispered, if you finally let go of the mission and chose the heart instead? He took a single step toward the warm glow of the settlement, his feet light on the ground, and walked into the embrace of the only home he had ever truly known. The hammer lay forgotten on the ridge. The war was over. And Kalen Thorne, once a broken soldier in a forgotten war, was finally completely whole.